Welcome to AIR4VR Counselors. I'm Dr. Olivia. Thank you for joining us. The focus of today's conversation is a rather unique one. Our guest, Barb Schiedermayer, shares her journey from being a VR professional to a parent with a child with disability and the impact this experience has had on her perspective as a VR professional. Barb, welcome.
Thanks, Olivia. I'm glad to be here.
Great to have you. Well, first, let's start by you sharing with us about your work before parenthood.
I would love to. As anybody who's been a parent knows, that there's life before the child and there's life after the child. And I would say that we typically look a lot more tired after the child. And that is very much the case the point for my case. But so before, about, gosh, I'm embarrassed to say, but about 30 years ago now, I started in the field as an employment specialist for private rehabilitation. And in that job, my primary duty was to go and try to facilitate connections between people who live with disabilities and employers. But what was interesting about private rehab was that you really are working for an insurance company. And that's an okay thing, but the insurance company has a set of ideas about what makes a good rehab, and it not necessarily matches up with what makes a good position or rehab outcome for the person with a disability. And that didn't fit with me so well. And so I talked with one of my coworkers who became one of my dear mentors, and she suggested that I always say go stateside, because in state rehab, she said, you're gonna learn real rehab. Mm-hmm. And boy, it was true. So I took a big pay cut to go to state rehab because I just knew that it was going to be better. And I'll tell you, it began a journey that I have thoroughly enjoyed. You know, there's been some potholes and hiccups along the way, but I have very much loved my life in this field. So I went from an employment specialist, which taught me the expectations that a rehab counselor should have for an employment specialist, and went to a rehab counselor position. And I was overwhelmed, as many are when they begin that job, because it is so multifaceted. Mm-hmm. I always tell people there are so many moving parts in that job, and it is a very hard job, but a very good job. So I learned a bunch of stuff and just loved it. And then I became the program developer, the transition program developer for our state. And that began a whole new journey where I was trying to learn why were we having to build a whole transitions program when we already did meet with clients regularly, or excuse me, I should say students on a regular basis. There were, really good teachers that were bringing students to us, and there were really good counselors that were trying to align services to help them prepare for school and or work. And so I was kind of confused about why did we need to make a whole new program? And so I turned to the literature, and I discovered some news that was very unsettling that I didn't know. And the news that I discovered was the result of these surveys that had been conducted over a period of 24 years, last one being in 2010. And those surveys revealed that people with disabilities dropped out of high school at twice the rate of their non-disabled peers, and that they go on to college at half the rate, and that they are employed at 1/3 the rate. Wow. And when you're in the trenches and you're working so hard, you can't even conceive that the big picture would be so dismal. And I was shocked. And so that became a passion of mine to really remember that in an attempt to raise that bar. When I became the transition program developer. That was 2007. And so those statistics were very much the standard of the day, or not the standard, but the information of the day. So that really just lit a fire under me that we've got to do better. And in addition to that, raising that bar, I also started to really incorporate in my practice and understanding in me as a person, as a professional, the understanding disability being a natural part of life. And it came to me as I would hear other people say things that would make me go, that didn't feel right. Or, oh, I'm seeing people that are separating people with disabilities and then people not, this divide. And as I grew, I came to understand that we were far more alike than we were different. And so, you know, I always say to people, if you know me for any amount of time, you've heard me say that whether we come to disability by birth, by accident, by disease or age, all of us at one time or another are going to likely live with disability. So it's about them, it's about us, right? So those two pieces of information, we got to do better. And oh, by the way, don't kid yourself. We're this together. And so those two things became huge to me. I was like this passion and this mission. And then in there, that was 20 years of time. And then my husband and I came to the parenthood journey kind of late, and kind of wink, wink. And so we adopted in 2008 our beautiful little girl Maddie, and of course, like all parents, we fell madly in love, and it was just a dream come true, and was wonderful, and all that stuff that new parents feel. And we were going along swimmingly. And then my mother-in-law, who raised 6 sons and was also a pediatric nurse, said, this child is not tracking. Now I thought she was, but see, this just demonstrates that parents can be in denial. You work for 20 years with people with disabilities and I didn't see it. And sure enough, after a whole bunch of tests, that started a bunch of tests, MRIs, brain scans, blood tests, all these different things with pediatric hematologists, neurologists, ophthalmologists. Oh my gosh, at 4 months of age, she was. We discovered that our beautiful little Peanut had a blood clot disorder that resulted in her having a stroke in utero. And that stroke ruined a significant portion of her brain, 40%. So where most children have brain tissue in their parietal and occipital lobes, Maddie had fluid-filled cysts. And so, of course, where those cysts were, that brain tissue was destroyed, resulting in a whole host of symptoms or functional limitations, disability speak, challenges. Okay, so Maddie could not see because her occipital lobe was destroyed. She had significant developmental delays. And so we were told, in fact, that she would possibly be vegetative. So as you can imagine, this world of hope and anticipation and joy and all these dreams you have, just, you know, it's very difficult. And I pretty much went into a fugue state, just, you know, a very numb state. And my husband, who I had dragged to adoption, was the guy who got us through. And what I mean by that is, because we adopted, in our state, adoptions aren't complete until there's a whole year that you've had your child. And so the adoption company had to come out, and I shouldn't say company, agency, a faith agency. They had to come out and ask us, do you want to give her back? And just, that's so surreal to think that you would go through something like that.
Yeah.
And my husband said, it will be through you will have to pry her from my cold, dead fingers. And so I knew right then that we together could do this. And so none of us ever entertained the notion of giving her back. You know, she'd already become a part of our who we were. And so we set out to find, what could we do with this particular vision impairment that Maddie was diagnosed with, which is called cortical vision impairment. So while her eyes are pretty much fine, her brain cannot interpret the signal, the visual signal that she sees. And
Okay.
so Maddie, what has been described as, she sees a kaleidoscope of pattern and color. And so what's very common for children with cortical vision impairment is to avert their gaze, because you can imagine all that information that your brain can't. And so our little kiddo, she did a lot of closing her eyes in new settings, and she squinted all the time like she was mad, which made sense. You know, that's Maddie was the perfect name because she looked mad. And so but the thing that was interesting, because of the loss of brain tissue, Maddie didn't even have those natural reflexes that children with some sight. She's seeing something, but she didn't have, so you could bonk her in the nose and she would not blink or anything. Well, we hooked up with one of the world-renowned specialists, Christine Roman-Lancy, and with her assistance, we started a protocol to basically teach Maddie's brain to see. And that was an odyssey, I'll tell you, that starts out with very small steps and leads us to a place where she went from being able to feel things, then look at them, three-dimensional things, and then those three-dimensional things were, then we took pictures of them. So we went from 3D to 2D, but I knew it was a good day when I went to flick something off of her face and she blinked and she went, or, you know, startled. We had taught that brain to see. And that, you know, over months and months and months of just sparkly things in front of her face and all that stuff. So I can tell you that now Maddie reads written print. She types Braille. She does both print and Braille. Okay. And she does have some cognitive delays that set her behind her non-disabled peers, but she runs on the regular cross-country team, and she rides her bike like a maniac, and she sat it all get out. And so she is far from vegetative. So what, you know, how wonderful that you just have to believe, you know, yeah. When some people, they come and upon her diagnosis, our family and friends built this big web of support around us, and, you know, just believe for us when we couldn't believe for ourselves, and encouraged us and all of that. And interestingly, in all that time, 20 years prior, I was able to see that so many of my coworkers and my clients had been my teachers. My teachers who live with blindness were showing me all the time how to do it. My clients who live with cognitive delays and the same exact blood disorder were showing me the way the whole time. It was as though they had prepared me. So it was really kind of a remarkable, you know, way to look at it. And so that's Maddie. And then I guess I would say that now you've got a VR professional who has a child with a disability. And so that changed even more. My passion for those things I talked about before became very personal. So not long after Maddie came, I went from the transition program developer to the state trainer. And it became very important to me that we did both the science of rehab, so we knew all the step-by-step things, we knew how to conduct our paperwork, we knew how to schedule our time and move people through statuses, but I also wanted us to understand the art the profession, which was the why. Why are we doing this? You know, and so that made me take a lot of the disability history and culture, and I folded that into training, so people would have a better, that they would go from their head into their heart when they were providing their services. So I spent time being the state trainer. And then I went to, became the regional administrator for our side of the state. And that made it very important that I streamlined. I did as best I could to create tools that would streamline our work so that when counselors were meeting with their clients, they could be present and they weren't distracted by a lot of the stuff that happened. So I was always trying to make things simpler so they could be present with their clients. And then we had a change in our management structure. And so my job then went from regional administrator to what we called the quality support or quality control officer or specialist. And in that job, I was primarily responsible for the recruitment, hiring, and training. Mm. And so that was the last job I held with the state. But I'll tell you, because of my experience as a parent and all the other work I had done, as I was looking at candidates to hire, I would be asking myself, does this person, because believe it or not, we had people who applied who didn't, but does this person like people?
That's a good question.
Yeah. Does this person want, would this be that person's joy to help people become the best, to meet their potential? And would they go the extra mile to do it? Or are they going to phone it in? And here was my litmus test. And I interviewed hundreds of people. I would be in the back of my mind thinking, would I want this person to be my kid's VR counselor? So you could see how it went from, excitement about the profession, and it was cool and I loved it, to being very personal and wanting people to do their best for our kids.
Yeah, so it sounds like really you went from focusing on the skills and the knowledge and then adding this extra piece of empathy. Like you wanted the people who come into this field to really be able to empathize with the young, the different clients that they'll be working with, along with their families, because you had this first person experience and you saw how important that empathy and that support and that genuine care was for your family's journey through this process.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that would bring me to, when you said it helped you to understand the parents. Well, that would bring me to one of my biggest foibles in this journey as a parent. Mm-hmm. Prior to being a parent, I encountered parents who, in particular moms, I call them the momsters. And what I meant by the momsters, I had great affection for them, so I don't want that to be misconstrued, but you could hear them when they were arriving to an appointment. I would say that click, 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 click. There was this intensity. They're coming down the hall. And there was this, they were there and they were getting stuff done. And sometimes it could be kind of intimidating. Mm. When I became a mom, I understood what makes a mom become a momster. A momster, a parent of a child with a disability. There's a tremendous fear and apprehension because your kiddo can often get marginalized. Or people reduce expectations based on what they think about that particular disability. And so we end up having to fight for things, to please see our child's potential. Please help me to get the accommodations in place so my kid can do her best. And so you're constantly kind of fighting. Well, before I really made that connection though, at the time, right after Maddie came, I was the regional administrator, and I knew how difficult it was to work with parents who were intense. And and so I was constantly trying to find the balance between being a reasonable, diplomatic professional that they interfaced with and a mom. So back and forth, back and forth. And one day, I'm ashamed to say it too long, but Maddie was in the 3rd grade when I had this wake up call. Prior to that, because CVI, cortical vision impairment, was not well understood by most people, including pediatric ophthalmologist. Our ophthalmologist is always saying, Barb, what have you learned that I need to know and pass on to parents? Because parents, out of urgency, we go out and dig, we find.
Yeah, of course.
And, yeah. So I had found the expert in Pittsburgh and carted my little kid, my baby, off to Pittsburgh to Dr. Roman. And I had found other things. And so I put together what I called the CVI, Maddie's CVI guide. And it was my way of explaining the protocol that we would need to use to help her in the academic world, because nobody had done it for me in the world. Okay. So I put one together, and I simply asked that the case manager in the school would kindly share that information with the following year, the new regular classroom teacher and any new paras. And I always advocated, maybe please keep a para, because I always have to bring them up to speed. And every year, from preschool, kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, I would be, please make sure they get it, because they wouldn't. They would forget to share the information, and I would start over. Well, first day of 3rd grade, moms, we got the cute little kiddo and their darling little clothes, and you got 500 bags of wipes and Kleenex and snacks. And because Maddie had a regular classroom and a special education classroom, I had double snacks. So I got into the room, got her parked in some of her friends, and I realized, oh, I forgot some of the things. So I went back down to the car to get those things. And when I came back up to the classroom, all the children, there were circular tables, and they were sitting around these circular tables, and they had pencil in hand, and they were looking and reading this piece of paper that was asking them what's their favorite color, what's their favorite food, all these like kind of introductory, get to know you, wonderful questions. But my child was sitting with a piece of paper in front of her, her head down, and nobody assisting her. It was as though she wasn't even in the classroom. And it broke my heart. It was like I saw something that I thought, oh my God, has this been happening that I didn't see this?
Yeah.
And so I immediately started to read from the paper and start talking with her. Maddie, what is your favorite color? And the classroom teacher, who is a gem, I love her. And she was caught off guard because she had not been given the preparatory material. She wanted to hand me pencils. Well, of course, any child with a low vision is not going to see a tiny pencil. So Maddie always had a stack of markers, big fat markers, but I had provided them, and they didn't even find their way to her first day, despite years of preparing the people in that school.
Yeah.
And guess what happened, Olivia?
What
My
happened?
monster hat came out of the closet, went on my head, fangs. I did not right then at the moment. I went in the car, I cried, and then I called my husband, and this is enough. So I learned that it is always parents, because they're the ones who go home with that kid. They're the ones who love that child the most. They drive the bus.
Yeah.
We've had remarkable teachers and paras, but ultimately, really, it is up to the parents to do a lot of that driving. And so from then on, it's like, we're there. We're finding out how are things going. And it wasn't like I wasn't doing that before, but there's more intensity. I have to make sure now I'm checking off. Did you understand? Are we doing this? I'm rewriting things, you know? So
it sounds like you went from like making requests and like kind suggestions to demanding.
yeah,
These are the things that my child needs to be able to be successful like her peers.
yes, you end up, and there's the fight. And even people who mean well, it is hard. It is hard to institute accommodations. It is very hard. I know it as a trainer, but you must. And so yeah, and so that is how I got my momster hat out of the closet and put it on, and don't leave it behind now. And that's my obligation to my kiddo and to our world, so that I, you know, help my child to be the most independent kid, young adult woman she can be. And again, I will go back to that. That's why I look exhausted.
So as we get ready to wrap up our discussion today, what are a couple of things that you hope our listeners take away from this conversation, from your personal experience as a seasoned VR counselor and a parent of a child with disability?
Well, when it comes to the parents, just remember when you see them that they are in a fog very often, that a lot of the information that they receive, especially if it's new to them, is confusing. So I always encourage counselors who are new, watch how you use language. Watch, try to get, you know, even with your clients, of course, keep the acronyms separate, explain things. Like, so for example, if you tell a parent that you're eligible for case management, describe what that means, help them to see what would case management look like in my kid's life, because they won't know that term. Okay. Also, if there's a funding source that has an unusual name, think of the function of the funding source. And regardless of what other people call it, like, for example, we have a waiver program. Nobody knows what that means. Even the professionals who administer it don't know what it means. So explain to the parents, this is a pot of money that we are trying to tap into to support HAB aids or independent living assistance or job coaching. And you're explaining so they can see it. What does that mean? Then, and remember also that they're constantly navigating from service to service to service. It's very confusing. And so be prepared to repeat, and give them hope. You know, if you believe in them when they can't. So just sharing little nuggets of, you know, I know a client who, and he's or she, blah, blah, blah. Just give them something to think about. Raise your expectation, help them raise their expectations. Along that same line, I say the same thing for students. Raise your expectations. What you might perceive as somebody who is, you're questioning, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know what kind of work is going to be possible. You would be astonished. And so when things get complicated, and they do, so for example, if you have a student who lives with a significant disability, in my brain, I would see that complexity and immediately default to everybody deserves an opportunity to try. I don't know what the outcome is going to be, but my job is to make sure that person has all the tools, the tips, the services in place to try. And more times than not, they rise. And I, you know, love that part of our job. And so keep your expectations high, and make sure that you're the navigator that's going to provide them all the information they need to make informed choices, and that's your thing. And then I always think of this too. I have a piece of prose that I keep in my head at all times, and it's a favorite line out of an Emerson piece of poetry, and it says, "If even one life breathes easier because you have lived, that is to have succeeded." And so I would say to all of you who are helping our kids and in the complex and trying times, that you are doing just that. You are making lives better, one moment of kindness at a time, and we are most grateful.
Wow, I think that's that is great. I feel like those who are listening, you're inspiring parents of children with disabilities, and definitely VR counselors, to just remind them about the importance of that empathy and instilling hope in the clients that they're working with. So thank you so much for taking the time to share your incredible journey. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Likewise. Thank you, Olivia.